where we speak with experts, leaders, and change makers about movements of social change that have transformed the landscape of Canada and the way we live our lives. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with former Chief of the Tsawwassen First Nation, Kim Baird, who also happened to negotiate BC's first urban modern treaty in 2009.
I always find it interesting when people achieve so much and they take such a strong stance, what their background is, what exactly inspired them. Did you grow up in a family of activists or people that stood their ground? What sort of gave you that passion to do the stuff that you've done?
I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. So I grew up in the sort of suburbs of the Lower Mainland, not on our reserve.
Oh, not on that one. Okay.
And we would visit and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until the mid-'80s that my mom moved back to the reserve. And when she had married, she had lost her Indian status and her rights to the community. So in the mid-'80s, Bill C-31 came around and she regained some legal rights. But it was really tough to assert practical rights, moving back to the community where she wasn't necessarily welcome for the choices she'd made as a young woman, all of these things, no housing. And so she was tough and fierce and resilient. And so she was a role model for sure from that perspective to really push for what she believed in not easy circumstances. So there's that. There's also the fact that for a good part of my childhood, after my dad died, we had a pretty transient lifestyle. I went to 7-8 different schools before I graduated. Sort of typical, sort of not good childhood story, exposed to alcoholism and other sorts of family violence issues and that kind of thing. So that, I think, had something to do with my sense of justice, maybe, I don't know. A third component is I grew up with 4 brothers, so I had to be a feminist just by default.
Yeah, yeah.
So those are probably big influences to my childhood. And we moved back to the community when I was a teenager, and I had to, I was the first to graduate high school in the community in over 20 years or something like that.
Really?
And so I went to college and I felt all this pressure that I should do something, and I had no idea what to do. And so I was taking lots of general arts programming, so every geosophy type of course you could imagine to figure out what I might like.
Mm-hmm.
And it was through that, and so I had all these term papers to write, and so I didn't know what I should write on, so I ended up focusing on my community, whether it be an English paper doing general background about the population statistics of the community, or whether it be something else. So then I started researching about Aboriginal rights and title and the history of colonization in Canada and that kind of thing, and that's when my social and political consciousness woke up, and that's how I began to understand why I was seeing the conditions in my community, what the root of that was. And then I also learned that there were potential options of getting out of that. Learned about the federal comprehensive planning policy and that sort of thing. So that was a long answer to your question.
No, good answer. I was now take a step back a little bit. Tell us a bit more about the reserve itself, the challenges that it faces, or did face, maybe as you grew up. What's the population like? You said you were the first to graduate, so that's a strong statement in terms of.
Yeah, well, I think so. To take a long step back, pre-contact Tsawwassen was a pretty large settlement. We're Coast Salish First Nation, we numbered in the thousands, and then with colonization and smallpox and the sort of scattering of our families, we were down to a handful of people at the turn of the 20th century. And so since then, it's been, the population's been on a slow climb. After Bill C-31 in the 80s, a lot of members came back, and since then the population's been growing more steadily. So I think we're over 450 now.
Yeah.
Small community.
Yeah.
And when I moved down there, we were probably at about, I would say, 150 maybe, on and off reserve, youth and adults. When I first moved there was about 10 houses, I think, maybe 12. Now there's more like 80 or 90 houses, right? So, yeah.
And the challenges? What is it like living there? What was when
Well,
you grew up? Well, you only went back in the teens, right? When you were
yeah, well, and we'd visit a lot because Tsawwassen's in the Lower Mainland, and so were we. So my mom would visit her sisters frequently, and I would tag along to see my cousins and stuff. But there was no infrastructure at all, no paved road, limited other things, like I think they had a party line for the longest time for phone. Cable didn't come until the 90s, I don't think. That type of thing. Lots of socioeconomic sort of issues, poverty, lots of drinking, that kind of thing. And just didn't look like a Lower Mainland neighborhood that I'd grown up in.
Right.
And so I wondered what the difference was, right? Why was there sidewalks in the neighboring municipality and not in our community? Just that kind of thing. Because that's pretty much your experience when you're a youth, is sort of the neighborhoods you see your friends in and grew up in, and the Smiths and the Jones and all that stuff, right? So, so when I moved there, I wondered why there was such a difference.
And so then going back to, you went to university. College, sorry. And very soon thereafter, you already got politically involved, did you not? How old were you when you first?
So I started college at the age of 18, and when I learned about the comprehensive land claim process, I approached our chief of the day, and I told him if we ever got a land claim going, I'd be interested in helping out, even if it was on a volunteer basis. And so he co-opted me on the spot to set up a research department for our community, and then I applied for the job. So when I was 20, I became a land claims researcher. And then my evolution within the organization went from there. At 22, I got on council, and so I always had a dual role since I'm political and as a staff person, sort of carrying the football. Although in the early years it was more in a supporting role. And then when I was 28, I became the chief and chief negotiator. So then I started actively being the person negotiating on Tsawwassen's behalf for the agreement. And yeah.
How common is it for someone, not only a woman, but of your age, a young age, to be chief?
Well, I was the second woman in our community. The woman before me was the first woman. Yeah, I mean, I don't know of many women that age that have been chief in Canada. I'm sure there's other examples, and it's changing all the time, but it was an anomaly in that most people don't expect a young woman, and I'm fairly soft-spoken, and to be a chief or a negotiator. So I did not fit the stereotype in most people's head, I think.
Right. Which is great. But I read somewhere that initially when you were you took on the role of chief, or even when you first got more politically motivated, that you didn't, self-governance wasn't necessarily at the top of your, it was more like economic development or the treaty, land claims that.
Yeah.
Right?
So when I looked at the comprehensive planning process in college and all that, I just thought, well, we're poor, so resources, cash, and land to develop would seem like obvious fixes to poverty. But as I progressed through my experience as a leader and trying to work under the Indian Act, and and our experience of trying to develop a basic condominium unit and the war we had with the local municipality and our inability to secure water legally, even though we had the pipes already.
And you couldn't secure it.
For economic development purposes, it was mind-boggling to me, right? And it was all about jurisdiction and governance, and the need for the Ministry of Indian Affairs to approve every little thing we did. So it was, and meanwhile, our community was very skeptical about the band council system, with good reason that it's not a very good system in my opinion, and tried my best to improve lines of accountability and transparency, but found that it was almost impossible to make much headway because there is just no legitimacy for the whole system in itself. So that internal dialogue of talking about how we wanted to govern ourselves and what would make it better was an integral part of that process. And I often call it our internal reconciliation versus the treaties viewed as external reconciliation with other governments. So they go hand in hand. You need to be ready to take on that jurisdiction and know that your community has the confidence in your system to handle it. So yeah, it was a long process of a lot of work to do all that engagement.
How long a process was it when you first started talking about it? And the actual, it was what, 2009 when you actually got it? Is that your term of the treaty now?
Yeah. So in 2003, the treaty process started. I think it was early 2004 when it officially kicked off. But we got a mandate from the community to enter into that process. The amount of money we could borrow to participate in that process. We set up a cross-section of the community to advise us on negotiations, and that committee turned into a group that advised us on the Constitution and still advises the community on our legislation that we develop and stuff like that. So it was a good model. Yeah. But we also did a lot of community meetings and a lot of family meetings with families directly in their homes to talk about these issues. And so, you know, the negotiations took about 12 years, I think. And so with every stage of the treaty process, we got feedback from the community, whether it be the framework agreement, the agreement of principle, or the final agreement. The community voted on those things. And in addition to that, every year the community had approved the budget for the treaty process to continue on. So we took engagement super seriously. Yeah. And it was a long, consistent, persistent discussion.
Was there always support for that process, or did you have some detractors who didn't think it was the right approach?
Well, there's detractors to the treaty process, and to the best of our ability, we tried to include their participation. It's hard stuff because it's very divisive, the whole topic, and some people don't think that the negotiating with governments is the way to go. And so trying to deal with that dissent while advancing as a community is pretty challenging. And the only thing we could do, I thought that we could do best to do that is just be very open about people's opinions, and if we made a decision that was different, that we say why, and make sure everyone knew that we've counted in all views when we make our decision. I think it's normal for any community to disagree on things. I don't think consensus is on something so complex is possible. But really, part of our learning and changing as a community is trying to figure out healthy ways to engage in debate where people felt safe in voicing their opinion on something that's very controversial. And you know, I know it's a lot to expect of people. You know, it's a 300-page legal document, forever changing our constitutional rights within the Constitution of Canada. It's not the normal discussion at most dinner tables, in my experience, although it's at mine. But aside from that, like, it's a lot to ask people to take that on.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fear and with a lot of good reason, right? So I'm glad we took that long approach to it. And it wasn't perfect. I'm sure there could be lots of things we could have done better. But when you're one of the only, when you're one of the first doing it, you know, it's hard to know, right? So I think everyone just came with that spirit or intent of trying to do the right thing and trying to solve a really tough issue that our community had been facing for over a century. So.
And you said one of the first. I thought it was BC's first urban modern treaty.
But there's lots of at that time there's lots of First Nations negotiating treaties in their communities. We're the first to actually make it over the finish line.
So how good did that feel?
Well, I was actually, so we're in a group of about 4 First Nations, and I was really hoping we would be second or third, and that someone else would sort of take the brunt of the attention and all that stuff, right? So, but the first vote that went before us, they rejected their vote, and so there was immense pressure on the community and our negotiation team about this, and we were in the Lower Mainland, so it was in the media spotlight constantly, and it was a different kettle of fish for Tsawwassen than many other First Nations. There's many who sign off, and it's hard to get any public attention to it or media attention. That wasn't our case, right? And I had a member of Parliament who was furiously opposed to it. The mayor was opposed to it. The public was skeptical about our ability to manage our own affairs. They didn't want us doing anything with the land that they didn't agree to, and all these sorts of things, right? So it was a tough political climate to break through.
You did.
Yeah.
Would you say that's one of your more proud moments as chief, as in your political career, in your regular personal and professional life?
Yeah, I think, you know, the ballot count at the community and hearing that it passed was one of life's memorable moments, and everything sort of tied into that. But there's a story about, obviously I'm extremely proud of my children as well, right? And there's a funny story that they came along at certain key milestones of the treaty.
Yeah.
So my oldest came at the agreement in principle. My second girl came at 3 days after we initialed the final agreement, and my third daughter came about 3 weeks after the effective date of the treaty. And so she's the first Tsawwassen child born free of the Indian Act. So all those make extremely personal, and the fact that I brought them to work with me, they've been in negotiations, they've been in the legislature, they've been an integral part of that part of my career, made it even more rewarding in some ways.
Yeah.
But another one of my favorite moments is when the provincial legislature introduced the settlement legislation, and to welcome my community, they opened the big front doors of the building, up the long set of stairs where usually only the premier or prime minister is supposed to go through. So it was a symbolic gesture, but important, I think. And so I got to lead my community holding my oldest daughter's hand up those stairs, right? So that was another moment. I was the first woman to address the legislature that wasn't an MLA, or the first Aboriginal woman, I should say. And so, there are lots of things that came with that. But the next phase, as far as, you know, that was the negotiation, but I had no idea that the implementation would be even more grueling and intense. So making it to the effective day of our treaty was another really proud moment. And the day before the effective day, we had a ceremony to burn the Indian Act.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What date was that, the effective day?
It was April 3rd, 2009, so on April 2nd, that would have been when we had a ceremony to burn the Indian Act. And just those sorts of things. I had to get up at midnight to sign my first laws. My ex-husband wasn't terribly happy because I was very, very pregnant with our third daughter. And so luckily I had other members of council that went to go sign all the documents in escrow for the land title office the next day. Integrating into the BC Land Title Office was its single largest transaction in its history. So lots of memories with making it work, trying to get the square peg into the round hole, and just taking over. And the thing about our approach to self-governance is that we hit the ground running. We really wanted to use the capacity we built in the negotiations and transition that to taking on as much as we can on the effective day. And we really wanted to get rid of the Indian Act as soon as we could. So, that meant 23 laws on the effective day to replace the Indian Act.
That's a lot.
Very ambitious, and we had about 15 months to do that. And that was one of 40 projects we worked on. So it was really busy. And, reflecting now on what we got accomplished in such a short period of time, it's remarkable, and a real testimony to the strength of my team, who pulled out all the stops to help make it work.
And just to make sure everyone understands what the implications of that treaty is in terms of vis-a-vis Indian Act is no longer applied at all, or is there?
There's some obscure provisions. So the determination of who is status or not status is still under the Indian Act, and for anybody legally deemed as I can't remember the term, someone who can't take care of their own affairs, there's still residual issue with that. But for the most part, the new governance model is called a concurrent law model. So all three federal, provincial, and First Nation laws apply on our lands at the same time, and the treaty says which laws prevail.
Not everyone agrees with reconciliation. You obviously feel it a worthy goal, and why is that so important to you?
Well, it's tough. Like when I first learned about the bad history of Aboriginal relations with the federal government, I was so angry, right? And channeling that anger into something practical is what I ended up focusing my career on. I feel extremely blessed to have been able to work on something for my career that I'm very passionate about. Not everyone's fortunate as that, but when it came down to it, I'm a very pragmatic person, and so it's not so much lofty goals of reconciliation that motivated me, but more real needs to have autonomy, to make decisions for ourselves, to have a better structure than the Indian Act, and that kind of thing. And we had discussions about whether we were willing to do that within the constructs of Canada, or if we wanted to be sovereign. And I think most of my community is quite practical too, and they take comfort in things like the criminal code and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms applying, and that kind of thing, and want to be proud of Canada, want to contribute towards that, and really believe in a vision of Canada that will treat First Nations honorably and resolve these issues. That being said, I don't think our agreement's perfect or anything like that, but I think it gives us enough tools to take control of our lives.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on the History of Social Change podcast. I'm your host, Elisa Birnbaum, publisher and editor of Sea Change magazine and producer of the History of Social Change project. Be sure to stay tuned as we discuss other social change movements that have transformed the landscape of Canada and the way we live our lives.